Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Daily Grace podcast. We are really excited to be back with you for today's episode. This is Shelby, and I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Crystal. Hi, Crystal.
Hey, Shelby.
And we also have a super exciting guest. Her name is Sara Hagerty, and we were just chatting with her beforehand. And when we saw an email in our inbox saying, hey, would you want to have Sara on to talk about the gift of limitations? We were like, yes, we do need someone to help us understand how our limitations are a gift, because they often don't feel that way. So we're really excited to learn from Sara today. We're hoping she gives us some tips to help us wrestle with the limitations in our own lives. But if you don't know Sara, she is a mother to 7. She is an adoptive mother. She is an author. This is her 4th book that will be coming out really soon. And when I asked her, how do you want me to describe you? She said, you can say I wear sweatpants most of the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Sara, just to kick us off here, would you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself? And people really love to know, they want to kind of get a feel for who you are. So one question we'd love to ask is, what does a day in your life look like right now in this season? That helps people just get a peek into who you are right now.
That's right. That's a dangerous question, Shelby. Last night, I was up in the middle of the night with a sweet 6-year-old who's had some deep problems sleeping. So my day started, I don't know, it feels like 12 hours ago. I have 7 kids, and I've got I have 20 all the way down to 4. Oh. So I do homeschool, and I spend my days with my littlest people. My older ones are in high school, and homeschooling at that age looks a lot different. They take some college classes and some co-op classes. So I'm doing homeschool in the mornings. In the afternoons, I take off that hat and I put on my writing hat, and I spend my afternoons writing. And then I swiftly turn, and some days get dinner on the table, and some days successfully make a phone call for takeout, and spend the evenings overtired and hearing Teenage Hearts that open at 9:30 at night.
I love that. Sounds like you have a few things going on in your life.
Just a few.
No big deal. Well, let's talk a little bit about your book. I know this is a topic that we love learning about personally, but it's also one that I think a lot of women want to learn about, maybe struggle to learn about, how are we limited? What are the limitations? And the title of your book is The Gift of Limitations, Finding Beauty in Your Boundaries. I think even that, like you said, is it really a gift? So I would love for you to share a little bit more about this. And also, could you just define limitations and even boundaries for us? And what does that look like for us? And how do we feel as women when we come up against those?
That's a great question. I think we all feel ouch, right? Ouch when we come up against our limits. I call a limit a fence line. It's a place that I can't go, that I don't have access to. It's a hedge in my life, and one that keeps me confined. And if I'm honest, most of the limitations in my life are ones that I resent, but I often don't name. So I kind of live fighting them, trying to overcome them, but not really realizing that they're a profound gift to me.
So what happened in your life that kind of prompted you to wrestle with your limitations? Like you just said, they are things that you don't say aloud. So how did you think, I'm going to write a book about this?
Well, I think I thought about writing a book about it much later than I lived it in one form. The first time I really came up against my limits was walking through infertility. My husband and I had 12 years of infertility, and there was a do not enter sign around that part of my life that seemed to be a rite of passage for so many women. And I felt this ache of, I cannot get there. No matter what I do, I can't get there. And going to baby shower after baby shower and having all these feelings surface about what I wanted but couldn't have, I had to begin to wrestle with my limitations that I couldn't overcome. We're in a world where we think we can kind of overcome anything. And we have so much access beyond our limitations. Like on our phones, I can know what's going on in multiple different countries, in dozens of friends' lives, and I can water my lawn at the same time. But in my personal, very real life, that's not my phone. With my infertility, I hit my limitations, and I started to have to personally wrestle with, what do I do when God says no?
Could you just speak a little bit more to that? I feel like that's something a lot of women struggle with, whether it's infertility or just something else, something that maybe other people have in their lives, but they don't have. And so they may not see it as a limitation or a boundary. Can you just speak to maybe encouraging someone who maybe has a similar story that's coming up against that?
Right. I think our limitations oftentimes have a power over us that we don't name or don't know. So we feel limited. We respond to our limitations. We resent them, but we oftentimes don't actually name. This is hard because now infertility was very overt, but there's a lot of other limitations that I have in a day with 7 kids. I can't go travel and see my college girlfriends all that easily. I can't on a whim go out to dinner with friends without having to put 4 or 5 different things in place. And so I think the part of the power of the gift of our limitations is actually learning to name them and to sit in the pain of what we feel from our limitations so that we can then bring them to God.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. That's really encouraging. So I think we all experience it in different capacities, but if we don't name it, if we don't acknowledge it, then we can't process it and we can't really work through it. And so we often want to like shove it aside, but it often comes back up. And so just to be able to like have the tools to process, I think is super helpful.
They have a silent power over us. In some ways, naming our limitations is like taking the cork off the bottle and releasing the pressure that they have over us. Because otherwise, I know for me in a given day, I have 6,000 thoughts in a day. That's what statistics show. How many of those thoughts am I trying to overcome something, thinking if I could just get on the other side of this fence line, I'm going to finally find relief. I'm going to finally feel contentment. But I don't name it. I just keep responding to it. So it has this silent power over me. I can't even begin to see the gift in my limitations if I can't name them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of along those lines, I would love to talk a little bit about like idealism. Like when we look at something, I actually want you to define like what is idealism? And then also how does that actually impact us negatively whenever we look to ideal expectations or just in light of our limitations?
Right. Idealism in some ways is just a beautiful thing. We were made to be idealists because of the hope that we have in God. But I think in many ways we live under the downside of idealism. Idealism is pursuing ideals at the expense of what's real. So I'm going to go after this vision I have in my mind of what my 20s should look like or what my 30s should look like at the expense of the reality that I have a sick parent in my 30s and I need to help take care of that parent. And the distance between what's real and ideal is big. So what do I do with it?
Where does this idealism come from? Like, how do we come up with the idea of what is our ideal situation?
Gosh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think it's in us. Like, I think like eternity placed in our hearts, I think we were made to have big visions and dreams and a hope for our life. But we oftentimes want to take it into our own hands and do it our way. And so idealism becomes like, I'm going to create dreams that I can get to. I'm going to create a vision and a world that's going to make me feel X, Y, and Z, connected, like I belong, attached to the people around me. And I'm going to pursue that at the expense of the story that God's actually given me. I love this quote from Bonhoeffer. He says, we must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. God will be constantly crossing our paths and canceling our plans. And yet idealism puts us in this place where we're going to pursue those plans no matter what. Like we're going to live for the big vision no matter what, at the expense of what's right in front of us in the story that God has given us right in front of us.
How can we as women identify when we're living in trying to like strive for an ideal reality rather than living in our reality? Like, I feel like it might be hard to discern between the two at times because you might just be thinking, no, I'm just, going to work and trying my best. And, and you might even feel like you are kind of a little bit juggling it all, although you realize that sometimes the balls drop. But like, how do we really identify, no, that I think that's ideal. And that is not my reality.
I think a lot of times our emotions are really good indicators that we are pursuing something outside of what God has put in front of us. Like when I'm angry and snappy with my husband, snappy with my kids, when I'm short with a friend over text, when I am frequenting the fridge and, Starbucks or on my phone, I feel like those tend to be indicators that I'm pursuing something at the expense of the story that God has given me right in front of me. Otherwise, ideals look wonderful. I think of my story, with 7 kids, we didn't plan to have this many kids. Our last child was a total surprise to us. And I was 42 and pregnant. So I felt like I was 80 pregnant with her. And I'm just immediately going to like how this is going to impact my investment in my other children, my connection with my family at large, my connection with my friends. And I kept pushing to like fit as much as I could in my schedule to show I'm going to keep reaching for like the dream mom world, and realizing like I'm crumbling in stress, and the stress and the overwhelm was actually the indicator to me that I'm pursuing an ideal more than I am actually pursuing the story that God has given me. And my limitations right now are actually driving my behavior more than seeing them as the gift that they are.
Mm. And so I know you talked about then naming kind of those limits and grieving them. Can you just like explain that process a little bit more? What does that look like for you to like name and grieve your limits?
I think grieving is really powerful, and I think it's a really necessary part of surrender. We throw that word around a lot, surrender. It feels like this something we can latch onto that's just this, but it's a massive word. Like it's saying, let go of what you want in exchange for what God wants to give you. And I think grief is like a bridge to surrender. Like I feel anger when I'm not getting what I want, when I feel overwhelmed with my life, when I'm not, as simple as like when I have plans for a day and I can't get to them because I'm limited with so many kids. Or in a season when my dad was sick and we were taking care of my dad as he was walking through cancer, and I couldn't live my 30s the way I thought I was going to live my 30s because I was taking care of my dad and feeling stressed and overwhelmed and reactive. And grief is this beautiful bridge that we often ignore to allow us to sit in the pain of our limitations so that we actually begin to bring them to God. Psalm 34:18, he is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Many of us have shards in our heart, but we don't ever name them. We're angry and frustrated and overwhelmed and stressed. Those are words we use a lot. And it's like God is whispering, saying, come grieve with me this pain of your limitations, and I want to show you the beauty and the boundaries that I've given you.
Yeah, I feel like a thread that I'm hearing is just this idea of longing, that like as women, just as believers, we want to pursue the Lord with everything we have. We want to pursue those ideals, even if we do that at the expense of really what God actually has in front of us. I don't think it's necessarily bad to have longings, but it might lead us down a path that isn't where we need to go. So can you just like unpack that a little bit, how longing could be both a good thing and maybe a negative thing in life?
Right. Well, I think with longing, sometimes it touches the deeper cravings in our heart that God put in there. So that's beautiful. Longing actually connects us to the things the dreams of God in our heart. What we do with our longing is actually everything. So will longing cause me to skip steps, to believe, I think of him being in my 20s and infertility and into my 30s. Would longing cause me to do whatever I can to get this thing now, when in reality, God may have had me on a circuitous path for a much bigger story that was going to reach deeper into my heart? What we do with our longing is everything. I think we also can be the reverse and just squelch it and become a little bit like robots. I'm just going to go through and be obedient with what God calls and ignore the deeper longings of our heart. I think that middle ground where I name it, and that's again, naming our limitations is powerful. If I can name my limitations and even name the emotions that I feel around them, I begin to unlock longing so that I can bring it to the feet of God, or rather even bring it to God's lap. So I could sit in his lap with my longing and say, you put this in here. God, what is your plan for this?
Yeah. I think, I know we've already kind of hinted at this, but so much of the messaging in the culture around us is if you have a longing, you should just go for it until you get it.
Yeah.
But it leaves no space for our limits, like we're talking about. It leaves no space for if that longing is actually never fulfilled. And so I think what's beautiful about the conversation that we're having is it gives us a perfect answer no matter what happens on the other side of that longing, because ultimately the Lord is our answer and not the circumstance or the change that maybe we're desiring.
That's right.
Sara, I know something you mentioned in your book is a productivity fast. And I have to tell you, I don't like the idea of this very much. My husband always tries to get me to rest. And I say, no, to me, being productive is restful. Like I would rather be productive than rest. And so I was intrigued by this idea of a productivity fast, although I have the temptation to put my fingers in my ears and just la 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 while you explain what it is.
So I had a friend who years ago, I was just telling her how at the end of the day, I was like so overwhelmed. I mean, day after day after day. And because I've witnessed myself as my family has grown, like I felt this when I had 2 kids and I felt this when I had 7 kids. There's some things that travel with us across several different landscapes where we have to start to go, it's not the landscape. There's something bigger going on inside of me. And this friend suggested, she was like, why don't you limit what you can do, what you let yourself do in a day and just see what God does? And it touched the deeper question in me, which was, how does God see me when I'm not productive? Or really, how do I see myself when I'm not productive? So I started to limit my list in a day. Like I am an uber producer, meaning I am trying to multitask, do 3 things at once. I'm sauteing onions and listening to a podcast, and there's a kid sitting at the table and I'm teaching her how to write her letters. If I can do that, I will optimize. But in that season, I chose to take the most productive hours of my day, which are the afternoons, and limit them to maybe 2 or 3 tasks and leave the rest of the space for walking in the woods, reading poetry, reading novels, very unproductive things. Like I didn't even say that was going to be when my quiet time was because I could see that as productive, right? But like limiting it to just wonder, pursuing wonder. And during that time, what I started to see is I actually got a ton done, which is kind of interesting. But in the midst of it, I started to see that I am beloved by God, independent of what I produce. I was happier. I felt more peace. I could breathe better. And it was like I was calibrating with what I could actually do. We are such optimizers that we fit as much in as we possibly can. And until we get sick or something major happens in our life, we don't realize that our human frames weren't meant to do this much. There are many times where I am trying to be 3 different people in one person. And it's not until I crash that I go, oh, wait a second, I'm just one person with this many hours in a day. And my productivity fast brought me back to, I'm just going to be one person today and do what one person can do. And I just found it was one of the most like fruitful times of my life where God felt tangible and I had deep thoughts and I could breathe. And when I was not like, spending the time walking in the woods, when I was with my kids, I was more present to what was happening in front of me. There was just a lot of fruit in being unproductive.
Yeah, I love hearing you say that and saying that that has been your experience, because I think if someone who hadn't done it said like, you should just try being unproductive, we'd be like, yeah. But I don't see that actually working out. So I love that you have that experience there. I imagine there are some people listening who this is like really touching them deeply and they are realizing, hey, I've got longings, I've got some idealism. Like, I think I need to stop and just reconsider some things. And that might even lead them to say, how my commitments are keep me so busy right now.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you ever have that where you had to kind of work through your commitments and like say, okay, what could I take off my plate to make time for this like unproductive time, or to just focus more on being instead of doing?
Absolutely. I will say, though, I think what's been interesting in my own life, and I've seen it in friends' lives, is oftentimes our health or our bodies limit us first before we actually notice the need to limit ourselves. There is sort of a gift in God giving us embodied bodies that migraines and exhaustion and frequent sickness can tend to be our body saying, hey, girl, slower still.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question, but I will say some of the listeners may be in a place like I've been in where my body has told me before I've even had the luxury of making those choices myself, because I just couldn't keep pushing. But I do think one of the most significant things to going, where do I even start, is actually naming the limitations and identifying the feelings I have around those. So is my limitation that I can't get enough done in a day? Is my limitation that I want more children or less children, than I want to be married, that I'm frustrated by this marriage? Like, what is this, and what are my emotions around that? And as I start to name the limitation and name my emotions, then I can start to go, where are there things in my life that are keeping me from bringing these emotions to God? So is it that I don't have any space to sit in the quiet and actually let these emotions come up and out? So they're not anger or a snap text at a friend, or a snappy comment to my husband or a snappy comment to my employer, but instead, am I giving space to sit down and process these emotions with God, sit with the Psalms and let the Psalms be my language to God about how I feel? I think that the step is we name our limitations and we name the emotions around them. And then I think God starts to untangle that and even highlight to us, hey, are you jam packing your life so you don't have to name these hard feelings, but you're living reactive and responsive to them? Are there things in your life that are actually preventing you from connection with me so that you could clear the cache a bit from all that's going on inside of you? I think in some ways God does the work after we begin to bring our emotions to him.
It sounds like there's kind of rhythms that we can hit in life as we recognize and name our limitations, as we grieve them. So I'd love for you mentioned this cycle: come, die, grieve, and live. Can you just explain that for us, like what that cycle means?
Yeah, come, die, grieve, and live. In many ways, it is Easter weekend for each one of us over and over again. We come, meaning we bring ourselves, our whole selves, just like Jesus did to the cross. We begin to recognize that those who want to save their lives will lose them, and those who lose their lives will find them. And so there is a cross for every one of us where there's some area of our life where God is saying, I'm limiting you. I'm holding you back from what you want. I'm putting you in a space that feels hedged in, and we acknowledge that it feels like a death. We acknowledge, like I think of, just having this many kids and being in a place where there's things I want to do that I can't do. And it's like the Lord saying, you don't get to do it all. So I walk that Friday of the cross out, and I let myself acknowledge the limitations and the cross in my life. And then Saturday of Easter weekend is the grief. It's oftentimes the part of Easter that we don't focus on, but in many ways, I think it's one of the most significant pieces of our walk with God, which is sitting in the grief of what we are dying to, allowing ourselves to feel the pain and to bring that pain to God and to grieve it. Because on the other side of that grief is the Lord giving us the perspective that our boundaries and our limitations are a gift. That's Psalm 16, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I think we oftentimes skip steps, and we want to move from Friday's death to Sunday's resurrection, not realizing that the in-between time is actually where it all happens. The growth, the fruit, the work of God in my life is when I grieve what's hard and I feel the sting of the cross on my back and the splinters in my neck. And I cry with God before God about those things. And then he starts to slowly move me into orienting myself around his story for my life that's different than mine.
Yeah.
So you mentioned surrender earlier. And so I feel like, just that idea of surrendering to the Lord, creating space in our lives for the things that he has for us. So why would you say that surrender is the sigh of life?
Surrender is the sigh of life because I think it's what we want most. Like, as each of us gets older, we start to realize year by year by year, we really want to be led. Our bodies and our world around us and our culture and our phones lead us to believe that it's best if we lead ourselves. But it's like the little girl, the little boy inside of us that is wanting to have a dad that leads us feels profound relief in letting go of our story and exchanging it for God's. Letting go of what we thought was best and receiving his story for us. That surrender, it's not something I read it, on Instagram, and there's a meme and I want to pray it once and have it happen, but it's really a lifetime pursuit of letting go and receiving that the limitations he's given us are a gift, that the things we resent are very well purposed by him for us to receive his story in exchange for the one that we think we want.
Yeah, that is so true. As you said that, I was like, yes, I believe that. That is so true in my life. Sarah, we have one last question for you, and I'm excited to hear your answer to this. This is a question that we ask every guest who comes on the podcast. We always say at the Daily Grace Code that the gospel changes everything. And so, Sarah, we would love to know, what has the gospel changed for you?
At this stage in my life, the gospel has given me a tenderness towards my weakness. Tenderness towards what I just can't make happen or do or produce. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. That's what the gospel's changed for me. And it's an ongoing realization that I can be kind to myself and my weakness and my limitations, because there's actually a paradigm from God in which my weakness is the perfection of his power.
I love that. It's like the gospel changing our perspective on limitations, on weakness. So I love that.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today on the Daily Grace podcast.
Oh, thank you guys.
We are going to include links to ways to connect with Sarah and her book, and you'll find all of that in the show notes. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast newsletter to stay up to date on all things Daily Grace podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.